Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Teaching with Inquiry. As we have continued through the month of November, November's focus for these videos is on assessment. And in particular for tonight's video, I want to focus on math and assessment. So tonight we are going to focus on how we can assess students in math. And we're going to be looking at a few different things today. In particular, we are going to be looking at how we can accurately assess math for our students. We're also going to be exploring how we can use the achievement chart and the 4 separate levels of achievement and how those relate to different types of problems in mathematics, as well as the question that might come in is, how do we do a summative assessment in math? Are we going to use tests? Are we going to use projects, or maybe a combination of both of them? And finally, the big question is, how exactly do you mark math for your students in a way that accurately reflects their abilities? So that's what we're digging into today. So I can't wait to share with you some of the different things that we're going to be talking about. If this is the first time that you're catching one of these shows, thank you so much for joining me. My name is Patty, and I am a junior grade teacher here in Ontario, Canada. And I'm also the teacher blogger behind madlylearning.com. And I come to you every single week here on the Madly Learning Facebook page to talk about how we can use inquiry-based teaching practices in all aspects of our teaching lives in our classrooms. So again, thanks for joining me, and I can't wait to dig in. So let's get started. For the first one is math and assessment. How exactly are we going to mark that? And the question often comes up is it right, is it wrong, or is it somewhere in between? And I think the biggest thing that we have to look at with math is that we have a tendency to want to say that math is black and white. And the question is either right or it's wrong. Now, for some questions, that is the case, but there's far more going on for students when they're answering math questions. So to simply say that the end process is either correct or incorrect, and to mark it either 100% or 0, is often not an accurate reflection of how students are actually achieving in math or where they are in terms of their learning. So I think that it's sometimes a challenge to communicate this with parents and also to students, and as well as a challenge of our own black and white thinking when it comes to math, is how exactly are we going to communicate a student's true level of understanding in math through our assessment. So I think we can look at understanding where a student might be. So if we are actually looking at marking a question either right or wrong, we do encounter a few problems when we do that. Now, the first is imagine you have a test or a quiz, and on there you have 5 word problems. If you give each word problem a mark out of 4, and simply say if they did the right process and they got the question right and they showed their work, then they wrote neatly. Who else wants to say what the criteria could be? But let's just say we're going to mark it out of 4 for each one of the word problems. That would mean that our quiz was going to be out of 20. Now, if your students are doing well at that mark, what's going to happen is if you have a student that gets all of their questions right, we will most likely give them a 4 out of 4. Now, a student might make a small error, and that might prompt them to get a 3 out of 4, as well as maybe a more significant error might be 2 out of 4. Maybe their process was right, but they made 1 or 2 small errors along the way. And if they're completely off, maybe a 1 or even a 0 out of 4. This seems like the very black and white way that we will mark student work. However, here's the problem. For me, most of my students are typically sitting between a level 2 and a level 3. Except when I mark in the way of right or wrong or black and white marking, what ends up happening is I have skewed results. A lot of my students are going to sit at the level 4, and then I will have some students at a level 3 and a level 2, but the majority of my lower level students that typically would sit around a C or even a C plus are going to end up failing that assessment. which in turn then discourages that student and makes them believe that they suck at math. Now, this is something that I was challenged with because I didn't actually think that students that were getting 48%, when I actually looked professionally at their tests, they weren't completely off. Sometimes it could just be a matter of them making small errors here and there, but it does end up skewing the results so that those students that are on the bottom half of, say, that bell curve end up scoring far lower than what I think they typically should. So instead, when looking at math, one of the ways you can look at, and I've coded these people here to kind of see where they are. So your greens are where a student would be getting an A, blues are B's, yellow is C's, and then you have a whole lot of students that are failing that assessment out of 20. Now, instead of marking it in more black and white, it might be more accurate to level your math work. So this is actually what I end up doing. If I'm marking word problems, I'm actually going to level them instead of giving them a percentage or say a 4 out of 4 for the correct answer, 3, 2, or 1, is I will actually assign them a level 4, a level 3, a level 2, and a level 1. Now, I base this on, if I had 5 questions, what is the most consistent mark that a student is achieving on each one of the questions? So if you look at the diagram that I have up here, you'll notice that if a student is getting all level 4s on all 4 of their math problems, then that's going to translate into about a 4+. And then that student on, say, their report card would get an A. Again, if you've got a student that's getting mostly 4s and some 3s, that might be a 4 or a 4-, depending on where they are performing in that. And that would also work out to, say, in more traditional ways, someone who got about an 18 out of 20. Now, as you go down further, you're going to notice that I have far more students that are coded yellow and even orange in terms of a level 1 and a level 2 student. So those students in that bottom row, in the traditional way, would have failed that assessment, but more accurately, those students are actually performing at, say, a level 2 or a level 1. Still not fantastic, but it's a lot different than the blow to that student from them failing. It's also a little bit more accurate than what you would typically get in the other way of marking. So again, this is what is a student most often, most consistently getting across those 5 questions. What level are they getting? And later on in the video, we're going to look at the rubric that I would use to arrive at those levels. So I do find this to be more accurate with my students. So when we are looking at the achievement chart, there are 4 identified levels on the achievement chart. And in our math and in our math assessments, we do need to try to make a balance between these 4 levels. We want to make sure that we have questions on there that are simply knowledge and understanding questions, where a student is just solving a problem or solving a question that we're giving them. These are more of your basic questions that you're going to be asking your students. We also want our students to be communicating their process and showing us their thinking and explaining their understanding of the question being asked. We have application questions as well as thinking questions, which we're going to look more specifically at the differences of those two on the next slide. So you don't have to have every single question that you ask in assessment on all 4 of these levels. In fact, there's going to be some assessments where you're just going to be assessing knowledge and understanding, and some where you're going to be assessing knowledge, understanding, and communication. And there might be some word problems where you're going to be assessing all 4 categories of the achievement chart. One of the things we need to remember is when we are making an assessment in math, that we have a balanced opportunity for our students to show mastery at all of those levels. So we can weight the different questions on our test to make sure that there's not a heavy focus on knowledge and understanding, and we have a stronger weight as well than what we would typically do on, say, thinking and application. So perhaps if we have lots of some of the basic questions we're asking, say, at the beginning of our test, that we can weight those thinking and application word problems a little bit heavier than we would the knowledge and understanding, because those are going to, I could ask 10 of those questions, but say 1 word problem could also be worth 10 because it's assessing different levels of achievement. So So looking at what each of these categories mean will help you to decide what kinds of questions you might want to put on your test. So let's imagine that we're going to create a test, and we're going to create a test out of 40. What we would want to see is we would have a balance of those 40 marks, as each of these 4 levels of achievement would represent about 20 marks each. Now, some questions can double up where you're assessing both communication and knowledge and understanding, or they can assess both thinking and application in the same question. But we do want to make sure that there is a balance, or as close as we can get to a balance between these levels of achievement. So when we're looking at the TAC, now I do recognize that the acronym TAC is out of order from what we're typically used to seeing the levels of achievement. I look at it from a bottom-up approach. Simplest is on the bottom, and then going up to the more complicated thinking questions. However, the TAC acronym is really easy for me to remember all of the different levels of the achievement chart, so that's why I use it. So starting at knowledge and understanding, these questions are the basic fact questions that we're going to be asking students. They're the ones where we give them the numbers, we give them the operation, and they simply just have to solve the question that we're asking. So this could be if I'm asking a question like 76 plus 84. And I give the students the question, I give them the operation, and they simply just have to solve it. That is a knowledge and understanding question. A communication question is where students are having to either show their thinking or show their process. So if I'm assessing communication, I want to see some thinking. There's certainly some questions where they just do it and I don't need to see their thinking, but there's their communication of their process. But I definitely do have questions where I actually want students to show their work, and that's where I'm assessing communication. Now, the thinking and application, for the longest time, I had those confused, and I wasn't quite sure which parts were which when assessing. And it wasn't until someone really simplified it, and I want to share that with you, the difference between what you're assessing when you're assessing thinking versus what you're assessing when you're assessing application. Application is simply the ability for students to take a word problem, extract the numbers that they're supposed to use, and select the operation and select a strategy. There's not a lot of planning. These are often looked at as your one-step word problem. So, Johnny has 4 baseball cards, Sally has 3 baseball cards. How many cards do they have altogether? You would know that you'd extract Johnny's information, you would extract Sally's information, and all together typically is a signal word for addition. So you would add those 2 numbers together and find your answer. That's an application question. A thinking question, however, is where students might have to use multiple steps in order to solve the question. So these are your multi-step word problems where students might have to do step 1, then step 2 before they can finally arrive at their answer. Now, the reason these are a little bit more advanced is because students have to decide what the process is that they're going to follow, and they have to think through that and organize and plan their ideas to get to the solution. They need to understand what information is missing, what information they need to find first before they can solve the second part of the question to finally arrive at their answer. So when assessing thinking, you want to make sure that you're assessing a multi-step problem that takes students a little bit more to be able to complete. And I always definitely like to have this type of challenging question on my assessments to really kind of figure out which students are able to demonstrate that skill and which students are still struggling with that skill overall. So the next question for math is, how exactly are we going to get this information, and which is going to be the better process? Are you going to use tests or are you going to use projects? Well, frankly, I do like to actually use both tests and assessments because I think the more opportunity that we can have for a variety of assessments for our students in math is going to be a better chance of us getting accurate information. Some students will perform really well on tests and quizzes, while other students will perform much better on projects. And having a mix of both is a great way to kind of validate your one assessment, your assessments throughout that process of learning. I definitely want to make sure that if I have a test and an assessment, that students are getting a consistent mark throughout those so that I have a valid piece of evidence in order to put a final report card mark on their report card. Now, there are pros and cons to both. Now, a test is definitely quick. They write it in, say, a day. It's going to take you maybe a little bit longer to mark because it will have a lot of questions condensed into a smaller area. I do find that there's far more work to differentiate. I know when I conduct a test in my classroom, I'm often taking over the staff room table to lay out all the various versions of the tests that I have to create for the multiple abilities that are in my classroom. And even more so if I happen to be teaching a split, I will definitely have, say, a grade 4 version, a grade 5 version, grade 4 IEP, grade 5 IEP, and then a hybrid mix of both depending on where students are in their level of modifications and accommodations for math. Tests are very much liked by parents because it is familiar and makes sense to them. It was often the traditional form of assessment in math, so it makes sense to parents. They can take it home, they see how their kids did, and it comes back and they see a mark at the end, and that is an easy way for them to do. However, I also know that tests do cause a level of anxiety in students because of just the testing environment. So if you have a highly anxious group of students, testing is going to be something, whether or not you want to evaluate, if that's always going to be the best, because that level of anxiety will probably lower the performance of those students. A little bit of anxiety and stress over tests is not a bad thing, but debilitating anxiety and stress is probably going to impact achievement on the tests that you give. Now, projects on the downside do take longer for students to complete. However, because they are open-ended, I can give one project and there's multiple entry points for my students. So it's much easier prep work for me to differentiate because I have multiple entry points. So it's accessible to multiple students. So I'm not creating a variety of variations of the same project. I can give them one project and then students can kind of do what they're able to do, and I can simplify small tweaks along the way instead of completely separate projects for each individual student. I find that projects are much more liked by kids. They make them feel a little bit more confident. It doesn't cause as much anxiety for students. And I do think that it's a little bit harder to mark because you might have multiple different versions. There's not just one answer key that you can use because students will have some open-ended and some choice involved in a project. So you're really marking things on rubrics and you will have to check the answers of each student's work instead of having a work page. But I do find that students are more successful on projects because there is that element of choice and it does reduce some of that stress and anxiety. I do use both frequently in my classroom, and I can get a variety of assessment by using both tools throughout my teaching process. So then the question comes in, well, how do you mark and assess math? So how do you actually mark it? If you are looking at all of these different pieces, if you're looking at the level of achievement, how exactly do you mark it? So if I go back to those little running dudes with the marks, how do I level everything and then communicate that final mark to parents and have it make sense? So when I'm marking something, we'll ask myself some questions before I sit down to mark it. And that is, what kind of question is it? What levels of achievement does it hit on? So I need to know that in order to be able to assess it. I need to know what success is going to look like for that class, for that question. And I also need to know what evidence that I'm expecting students to show for a competent understanding. Now, this is especially true if you're doing a project. So I will often use this rubric or something very similar as a way to understand the different levels of achievement across the different levels, level 1, 2, 3, and 4, or level D, C, B, and A. So if I'm looking at my TAC, I have the communication where they are not really solving problems and I am making sure that they may make some mistakes. There might be significant errors or limited knowledge and understanding of that content. Where they're moving into a level 2, they're solving most of the information correctly. They might have small minor errors versus a level 1 where there might be significant errors. I'm sure we've all seen that student that they have everything right, but they forgot to carry the 1 and they make a small error in their addition in a big, huge problem, and that ends up changing their whole answer. But yet their process was correct, their communication, their understanding of the problem was all there. It was that 1 minor error. And in that case, that's probably going to be a level 2 instead of, say, a 0, simply for getting the question incorrect in the final step. Now, level 3 will be that the answer is correct and that they used an appropriate strategy. And that's different from a level 4 where I do expect the most efficient strategy. So if I'm doing addition or I'm doing multiplication and a student chooses to solve a multiplication problem using repeated addition, at grade 5, which is the grade I'm currently teaching, using repeated addition is going to get you the correct answer. However, with larger numbers, it's probably not the most efficient strategy. A level 4 student will use the most efficient strategy and use multiplication instead of relying on earlier learned strategies such as repeated addition to solve a multiplication problem. If I'm looking at communication, really what I want to see at a level 3 is I want to see that students are communicating the evidence of their learning. Do I see how they got from point A to point B? Do I just see an answer at the bottom? Because if I'm simply seeing an answer at the bottom, then they're not communicating their thinking to me. I actually want to see how they arrived at that answer, and there should be some evidence on the page of how they got there. Some students will give you a partial understanding, and that would be a level 2. If they give you a decent understanding, a decent representation of their thinking, then that would be a level 3. And those students that are going to give you a thorough explanation of how they arrived at their process, including they may even label diagrams and show all of that, then that's definitely going to be that thorough understanding will qualify as a level 4. For application, you really have to look at, can they go through all of those steps? Because the application is, can they extract the information, choose the correct operation, and solve the problem efficiently without errors? And really, if they're doing those 3 things, that will give you a basis for where they are on that level of achievement. So if they're able to do it most of the time, then that would be a level 3. A thorough understanding using the most efficient strategies would be a level 4. A level 3 would be some less efficient strategies, maybe some small errors, but they still have the gist of how they're going to solve the problem. And a level 1 is they really weren't able to do it. Now, I also look at a level 2, if we're looking at word problems, is did they require assistance from a teacher in order to solve that problem? Now, when they're doing a test or an assignment and they ask me for help to sort through what the question is asking them to do, I will often take a colored pen and circle that portion of the question as I'm walking around helping students. And that will indicate to me when I'm marking it later that that student required help to understand what the question was asking them to do. And automatically, if you're going to require assistance to extract the information, choose an operation, and solve the problem, then that would go, even if the question is right, because you required that additional help to extract that information and solve the problem, then that would be a level 2. Now, that's not to say that you've got students that require a little bit of chunking or scaffolding, that would be different, but you've got to have students that are doing this independently to achieve that level 3. And finally, for the thinking and application, it really follows the same as that application. For the thinking process is that they really have to be able to do step 1 and then step 2 of those multi-step word problems. They have to understand what information they have, what information is missing, and how they can get that missing information so that they can finally solve that final question. That really is the key, and if they can go through those multi-step problems and understand what the question is asking them and accurately get to the answer in the most efficient way, then that's a level 4. If you've got a student that's going through and they may struggle at some point, they may need a little bit of help here and there to find what to do first or what to do next, that's going to tell you whether or not, depending on the level of assistance they needed or how much they understood step 1 and step 2, will be your difference between a level 2 and a level 3 for those thinking type questions. And a level 1 is simply that they weren't really sure how to even go from level 1, level 2, could not extract that information, did not understand what the question was asking them, or they gave you an incomplete or partial understanding. So maybe they solved step 1, but didn't continue to solve to the end of the question. And that would be your difference between your level 1 and level 2. So then I have a few examples for you. So looking at how you actually mark it. So I have 2 examples up here for you. The question was, how many ways can you make 240 using addition? So if you're using multiple strategies to solve, so you see there's 109 plus 131 will give you 240. So you have students thinking differently. Are they using addition? Are they using some subtraction? They're using some different strategies. There's not a lot of ideas of how they're getting their answers, except for some of these stacked standard algorithm type questions, versus the second example where you have a lot of repeated addition but you could be using, really that student could be using multiplication. So you have a variety of different ways and of them using it. And I would say that both of these students would be looking at a level 3 or 2+, depending on where we were in our process of learning, what grades they would be. So if you're looking at a grade 6 answering still with repeated addition and not using some multiplication in this case, I would be a little bit concerned that they're still relying on repeated addition. Versus if you have a grade 4 student, say in the beginning of grade 4, then repeated addition would be a perfectly fine, acceptable way for them to get to that answer, because their strength in, say, multiplication and understanding multiplication might not be there. And I do realize it says using addition, but you get the gist of that. Now I have another one where I have students, and this is a knowledge and understanding question, and it does have some communication because I would like to see the process in which they use to solve. Now they're simply just solving these questions using subtraction, and I'm looking for a variety of strategies. The most efficient strategy with pencil and paper would simply be using the standard algorithm. However, there's multiple ways to do it. One of the things I really like is for a level 4 student to be doing is to show their answer in multiple ways so that they can ensure that their answer is correct. So they should use the most efficient strategy first, and then it's always handy if they are going above and beyond by showing and checking their answer using a second strategy. It's always important that you have students who can use multiple strategies and not just the standard algorithm that they've memorized, but also using some mental math strategies as well to help and check their answer, including estimation and so on and so forth. And finally, I have word problems. Now, these are an example of where students are not communicating their thinking, and they're simply just writing out answers, and they have some process, but they're not necessarily what I would say is a thorough understanding of what it is that they're doing. They have a bunch of numbers on the page. There's some evidence of their support for their final answer, but it's not necessarily a thorough understanding. So while they may be sitting at a level 2 or a level 3 based on their answer, they're certainly not at this point a level 4 simply because they got the right answer. The level 4 requires a much more thorough understanding and communication of their results. So I hope that's giving you something to think about in terms of how you can assess math in your classroom using the levels of achievement chart and making sure that you are having a balanced assessment approach using those 4 levels and giving you an understanding of what each of those different levels means when it is related to math. So thank you so much for joining me. We are going to be continuing next week on assessment, where we're going to be talking about assessing writing in our classrooms. Thanks so much for joining me, and we will talk later. Bye.